Hello everyone, today we continue our video about medieval combat psychology as far as foot troops are concerned. Last year I made a pretty successful video about the medieval knightly combat psychology. For some reason the video made the first half of the episode that I made the other day received an equally large amount of views for some reason. I would really like to know how or why, right? I presume, just as I did when I first made that sort of video about knightly combat psychology, that people are somehow interested in the concept, in the ghostly concept of psychology per se. Yeah, they expect maybe some content on, I don't know, look at the research about PTSD in Afghanistan or whatever. This is not what we do. For the simple fact that in order to understand combat psychology, you have to first understand all that is above the individual perspective, right? You have to understand the art of war. You have to understand essentially what war is in general. That's why we have also the Von Kriege series. If we go viral at some point after several years of attempts, I never really attempted to be fully viral, of course, would have really helped. We're going also to resume the series about the Von Kriege. I really, like, my plan is to do it anyway, but of course the sort of better grounded the channel is, and the greater the likelihood that we're coming back on that for different reasons, because essentially if you want, again, this is why I brought that up. If you want to understand combat psychology, you have to understand what war is. You have to understand politics, especially, and I always look at what, generally speaking, people like to watch, like online. It's this sort of Call of Duty first-person view, hyper-subjectivized and hyper-sensitized version of what war is. Like, if you look at basically in the last 20 years, all movies, all video games, any kind of interest revolving around combat, as you can see also on YouTube, is basically reenactment. It's just one guy explaining to you how war is based on, I don't know, just weapons, right? If you want just to step up toward the meaningfully relevant dimension of combat, you should at least understand how these guys fought in a formation, how battles actually worked, not how, unfortunately, also current scholarship is resoundingly failing in providing some adequate evidence that is not sort of coming from people that are not polymologists by formation, really, and or that revolves always forever around either Crécy or Azincourt, and no other country, no other time, no other place, whatever. This is my, again, I love, for that matter, myself, Azincourt and Crécy, and I work with people that literally specialize in that, right? But my role as Schwerpunkt, and also personally, professionally outside of here, is to insist on the fact that if you want, also in that case, understand how battles worked in medieval warfare, you have to work, in fact, much more than trying to understand how, I don't know, what was the draw of a longbow, or what supposed effects that weapon would have had just per se. You would be surprised by how stuck still even the academia is on this stuff, and is literally not looking at anything around. Naturally, in these videos, we're also, as you understand here, browsing, we focus mostly on Flemish warfare, for that matter, because there is pretty sort of interesting insight. There have been scholars historically that sort of showed us a bit the way. Related with Flanders, you have, for example, the great work of Jan Frans Verbruggen. You have there are some sort of later, I will not make later names because I'm a bit more skeptical when we look at sort of Belgian historiography, how, for example, the same battles Kortrega represented entire books on the battle and basically no tactical reconstruction. This is so typical, so typical. So on Schwerpunkt, as always, we go step by step. I'm glad if you watch these videos for some reason more than the average. Of course, I give you this friendly reminder that, you know, my videos are entirely made in the same way, right? So if you have any interest in this kind of video, aside from this, they're also all entwined with one another. So if you're interested in this video, there's absolutely no reason why you shouldn't be interested in the others, right? If you think that there is some kind of esoteric knowledge you can acquire just by, you know, watching for 20 minutes a video like this, like, just know that, you know, here, this channel is not about entertainment. It's about hard work, right? You have to take notes. You have to study this listen over and over again. It's a completely different format for a reason as well. And as you know, since the beginning of the channel, I never really cared about any other work other than this on the platform. Now, we can go back to what we're discussing at a time, switch actually from Flanders temporarily to, we'll talk also about here, you will see the Swiss and so on. The First Crusade, right? We've taken this broader range between the 11th to 14th century and focusing mostly on Northwestern Europe, not even just mostly Flanders. Here we shift towards the Levant, the Outremer states. By the way, I would like to point out here and there you have people that approach my videos for the first time. You should talk about also other ways of war because, you know, in Europe, like at this time, like, I don't know, in southern Spain or in southern Italy or in Eastern Europe, they fought in a different way. It's not even true that, for example, in southern Italy, they fought in a different way, but let's skip that part per se. It's also, one could easily make the case that also Reconquista warfare was, first of all, a bit different overall. It's all true by degree, right, if you want it, right? But also, don't think that the Almoravids or the Almohads fought in this radically different ways from the Christian Iberians. But, you know, who cares about finesse or actual objective assessment? Yeah, there is a little problem, right? Maybe you didn't know because this was supposed to be a criticism about the fact, you know, oh no, that I have to be told how people fought in medieval Europe. Well, you may have incurred in a little sort of slip there. I have several hundred of hours of videos, all right, on the very specific regions that, you know, that you covered from a strictly military historical point of view. So it's a bit unlikely that I have to be lectured by sort of the first passerby. Now, during the First Crusade, foot soldiers likewise panicked beneath the walls of Antioch, right? We've seen it because I made also a video about the Battle of Antioch, for that matter. This was mostly before, during the siege. In fact, the Battle of Antioch was after the siege. The Christians had seized the city and were counter-sieged, right? But you have this prolonged operation between 1097 and 1098, whose final stages saw the Crusaders themselves, in fact, besieged inside the city by a large Islamic relief army, obstructing the Knights so severely that the Crusaders were defeated, at least in several sorties, until the discovery of the Holy Land's restored morale, right? We're told by Armand of Augier, as a matter of fact. We will surely come back on the Principality of Antioch. Never really made a video about that case. Was the foundation establishment, was the main crusade force was already inside the city and so on. But that's a very interesting step because not just the siege was grueling, but at this point the Crusaders were basically starved within the same city, and that's how they resolved themselves after being spirited by the recovery of this most precious relic to launch this sally against Muslim forces and to actually overwhelm them. And by the way, with apparently a divine apparition, right, of an angelic host at least descending on the plain from the nearby mountains, as also the Muslims had tried a flank attack as well. And so that's actually what matters the most when you reconstruct these battles, what kind of fantasies excited these fighters for us to try to grasp anything about the psychology of these individuals. And naturally, it's very complex. That's why I'm making so many and so very long videos on the subject, because it's something that you should be sort of introduced step by step, because abrupt statements do not help anyone. All right, first of all, they are reductive, but secondly, they probably don't provide you with enough background to properly get what truly matters. As I said at the beginning, this sort of scientific naturalism for which we should treat people as animals that, you know, just react to experiments, whatever, as opposed to understand the deepest meaning of self-sacrifice in holy combat. So from a metaphysical point of view, is entirely displeasing, especially if we're talking about actual holy war, like in this case. But every war in the Middle Ages was holy, right? It was always based on the metaphysical precondition without which any existence was understood at the time not to exist. You're being told that the Crusades were wars of religion, as if there hadn't been any other war of religion. They were all wars of religion, right? These were sort of more ecclesiastically and especially papally directed. It's a big deal. Made lots of videos about also this institutional side of the Crusades, right? How they came into being from holy war expeditions had been carried out way before 1095. Now, the siege of Antioch, as we were saying, lasted from October 1097 until the city fell in June 1098 through the betrayal of a tower by an Armenian named Firuz. Once inside, the Crusaders were themselves invested by this large Islamic relief army under Kerbog of Mosul, and resulting shortages of food and demoralization among the infantry are recorded by the aforementioned Raymond of Vauguier, that was the chaplain to the same Count Raymond of Toulouse, the count of the most powerful Occitanian principality, who notes how the foot soldiers blocked the gates and hindered the knights' attempts to break out, interestingly enough. Naturally, when we read these sources, we have to be relatively careful, but because here, say, how would that actually happen? We have this information, and then we have to imagine this is not merely a technical impediment. I mean, yes, in arms, this infantryman could say, no, well, are you crazy? If you go out, you're going to get killed. You want to bring us with yourself. Actually, as we've seen in the Battle of 1098, the entire deployment of the Crusader army under threat of being assaulted by Carboga, that actually did not mind very much. He gave, and that's how much also we don't understand, gave time to the Crusaders for adequately lining up for battle, which required also, as also the other battle accounts provide us, obviously with a combined armed force, cavalry and infantry. So this is more just a voice. This is telling us something very interesting. We can translate it in those terms, namely that there was surely some moral divide, as we also recounted in the previous part of this episode, regarding sort of the commoners, footmen being tendentially more, sort of less morally structured, let's put it in this way. They could achieve peak heroism, peak levels of courage at least, and they surely had a quite necessary, actually, military capacity, but they were definitely less capable, experienced than the knights, than the noblemen that knew, in fact, best how to employ them. In fact, that's what I always say when I talk about history of sort of infantry, medieval infantry, but not only. The noblemen were essentially among everybody, like the individuals who knew best how to employ infantry. The myth that infantry was some sort of jolly that at some point broke out for some reason because you bothered that rough peasant over there, never mind the entire hierarchy and stratification of medieval society and sort of all what permeated it in an ideological, spiritual sense, and the fact that peasants, of course, were kept under but were also cooperative in that role, is that indeed knights were the single most aware, acute understander of how important infantry was, and they were more aware of, and fully aware of infantry military potential than the infantry themselves, right? And this happens for different sort of, again, spiritual, anthropological, sociological reasons, but also a quite and higher and obvious authority experience in tactics, in what pertained how to line up this man as well. That there was properly a guidance that the knights exercised for the whole army. It was not just recognized, right, but properly celebrated for the obvious reasons that bring, in this case, for example, the Crusader army to win as well. So this showed us, as we've seen also in other videos, in other instances, including in the first part of the video, that the infantry could actually did as it was necessary, right? It doesn't matter how subordinated and inferior to cavalry at this point, because cavalry was the upper hand now. It wasn't fully decisive. You have to wait the third quarter of the 12th century in the battlefields of Western Europe to be sort of fully dominant until basically the early 14th century, mostly throughout all the rest of the Middle Ages, telling the truth. That they could make a stand themselves. They could also, and they were able, really, because that's what courage also is needed for, not to win battles, but surely for getting yourself killed if you don't know better, for that matter, to make leverage, to say their own, right? And the fact that here, like, infantry were trying to say, no, don't go out. It sounds more like some sort of comic scene, but it actually speaks of the relevance of infantry after all, right? We'll see better in other videos about Crusader warfare and Crusader army organization that indeed infantry in the Ottoman state seems to have been tendentially more important, right? For different reasons. A more imperfect feudal system over there, the fact that the same cavalry was tendentially lighter for probably mobility and environmental reasons, even though the fundamentals do not really change that much, right? But we will come back on the matter. Let's fast forward toward the 14th century, and let's talk about the Battle of Laupen in Switzerland, right, 1339. This is a very famous clash of the early Swiss, so to say, military history, right? This is the Habsburgic phase of the Swiss Confederacy's wars. As I always stress, this early Swiss army was radically different from the one of the mid-15th century, probably worked on a completely different basis, not just compared to the previous army, but in this sense, of any other army that had preceded it elsewhere in Europe, right, in medieval times, and you know why. Today we don't venture toward the later Middle Ages, but say I made an entire video about the Habsburg-Swiss wars that cover also Laupen. We never really made a video about the battle. It's very interesting. This is definitely kind of clashes we're going to cover through the tactical reconstruction, primary sources, as we always do. Here also the numbers. Every time I talk about numbers in these videos that are not aiming at dissecting every single source at our disposal, I very often come up with my own figures for that matter, but they can be profitably debated. But I'm just going to give the number for the sake of scale. This is what matters. There we have nearly 2,000 of a 5,000-man Bern contingent fled at the very outset of combat. This was an action fought on June the 21st that secured Bernese dominance actually in the region and paved the way for the city's permanent entry into the Swiss Confederacy in 1353. The Battle of Laupen was fought between the forces of Bern and a coalition of Habsburg-aligned lords in the city of Freiburg. Despite the early flight of this large portion of the Bernese infantry, which tells you also in terms of psychology how things could literally melt. We've seen it also in the previous video, and just at the appearance of knights, even dismounted on some occasions, of the footmen intended as commoners in that case. The remaining troops and their allies from the forest cantons held the field with disciplined pike formations, establishing Bern as the dominant power in the western Swiss plateau and demonstrating that even partial cohesion could turn the tide against superior cavalry. Yes, pike formations, I mean not entirely pike formations, but definitely the first ranks that were, as we explained, the only way you can stop cavalry, right? There's literally no other weapon that stops cavalry whatsoever in any meaningful unitary sense, right? You can have missile helping yourself in that, and combined armed tactics are kind of the best, but never underestimate in the sense that while combined armed tactics are a thing, and both sides were somehow using it, I mean, there was always some missile element, but just, you know, especially in Swiss warfare, it wasn't really much, right? It wasn't, in any case, as light infantry that relevant. This is the point I'm making here. This is true also from the Habsburgic side. If you have heavies against heavies, this also happens. You can have these other auxiliary forces somehow backing them, but it's still heavies against heavies. In this case, heavy cavalry mostly, and heavy infantry from the other side. Can result in this also more incredibly bloodier battles. Like Laupen again has its own characteristics. Is quite fascinating because it does have this sense of ground holding that, as we explained in the first video, is essentially how infantry at this point can't solely hope to withstand a cavalry charge, very differently, as I was saying before, from the Swiss of 100 years later that devised a pike prevalent system that required, in fact, a completely different level of political social wiring revolving around, in fact, putting in common much vaster resources in order to specifically train large formations of pike. They were more difficult to keep together, right? It had to be thus more intensely trained. Here, the Laupen is a typical battle of, in fact, not quite the first half anymore of the 14th century, but basically in the wake of that, or these sort of, this is especially the case for Germany, right? Or at least these fringes of Germany, right? You can look at the Dithmarschen, you can look at Switzerland. Yes, these are Germans, there's some kind of different thing. The Swiss are more like the mountain Germans. They, in fact, also quite cleverly exploit terrain, and not just in a ground sense, but also because literally their position was more decentralized. There was a strategic relevance of Swiss territory, but Switzerland didn't literally have much otherwise in local in place to really to sustain some kind of greater power. The Habsburgs, as soon as they went over to Austria, that obviously was from their own otherwise originally Swabian possessions, but they were being challenged in the sense as feudal landlords and former also monarchs at this point. Like the Habsburgs are not kings of Germany anymore, but they go at war with, in fact, forces that are, as we've seen, also relatively small. This was actually a slightly bigger battle, but as you understand here, we are in the thousands, right? These are fairly marginal wars, other than just battles for sort of the bigger picture of European politics, strategy, etc. But thanks to local documentation, they also offer this glimpse of what a battle between heavy cavalry against heavy infantry at this point would have looked like. There were also, by the way, dismounted knights at some point. There is a general, especially toward the mid-14th century, some sort of tendency to bog exactly because the contingents were smaller. There wasn't much of a grander formation capable of simply smashing against a determined foe. Doesn't matter how unprofessional, like in this case, the Swiss were, right? So this is something you see by mid-14th century, also among the same French, among the English. So actually the top armies, among the top armies in Europe at the time, that also not say like most armies, but say in that case tend to dismount, even though their men-at-arms were fully trained as heavy cavalry as well. This is because the smaller the armies, the actually more important terrain becomes. There's a great shift with the mid-14th century crisis from the previous formations. We've seen also yesterday in the video about the Albigensian Crusade, the Battle of Muret, where there is an in-depth series of battle lines, right? It is typical of the 13th century till the early 14th century. You still find it at Crécy, for example, from both sides. And from the 14th century, where ground is more important, armies are smaller, and so also field fortifications are more relevant, whatever. It's about holding that line. There are also other instances, of course, of different battles in depth. Battle lines, battle is also an equivalent for the term. But there is, if anything, the return to some more divisional line, right? So what were the various battles now in depth now were essentially center plus wings, right, of most of these mounted men. Not always. Again, there is plenty of heavy cavalry combat across Europe that is the more preferred to begin with. There are also lots of circumstances where the enemy is particularly well dug in, and there are fortifications in the field and so on. We're not talking about siege warfare, of course. Foot combat was also pretty darn frequent. In fact, in this videos, as we've seen the other one, it's going to be just two. I presume today we're going to finish this. We're talking not much about infantry combat per se, but infantry in a socially meant, so mostly commoners, right? Those who didn't even have a horse to begin with. So we will surely make more videos about dismounted men-at-arms that are very underrated, as you know, especially from the 100 Years' War, where the longbowmen usually steal the scene, even though they were essentially just a secondary force. And by far the men-at-arms were more important, but it's also about combined armed tactics. Now, although infantry remained perpetually vulnerable to panic, no less than elite knightly units, or at least more frequently than elite knightly units, but still tendentially when caught unprepared or in disorder ranks, which is also a way in which you catch the enemy off guard, and you can definitely take advantage of that. This is also how the later Swiss pike columns, really in the 15th century, succeeded against what was, together with the Venetian conducta, the most powerful army in Europe, namely the ordinances of Charles the Bold. And so don't think that also in there, that was an incredibly sophisticated system. It was still a mono-arm system, right? But in these panic situations, the acquisition of combat experience, of course, would produce a massive transformation in their defensive tenacity, and or at least this is mostly a moral phenomenon, a political phenomenon, right? We've seen a historical one, interestingly enough, because it is true that before, for example, the Battle of Golden Spurs, basically for over a century, no infantry had ever even been heard defeating cavalry. There had been experiments, as we've seen in my recent videos, about the first and the second Lombard League wars, in which indeed, not only, like we've seen it at Bouvines with the Brabançon, etc., which infantrymen had withstood, and somehow successfully in some cases, just in those cases because cavalry had helped them, the might of their mounted enemies as well from the other side. All right, and that was tremendously inspiring. I mean, it had been shown probably that there was a muscle to this infantry that, if properly exercised, if you were properly motivated, you could put to pretty darn good effect. There are some political tensions. This is best exemplified by the Italian communes, where at some point in the first half of the 13th century, before returning to a more synergic and actually even more effective combined arms capacity in the second half of the 13th century, the pedites, as they were called in Latin, were, because they subscribed essentially to the so-called popolo in communal politics, and were essentially fighting in order to show knights that they needed more rights, that they could actually check their own cavalry within the narrow city streets of in fact the urban topography, that they could literally fight on their own out there autonomously. Right, so disagreeing with, a bit as we've seen here during the First Crusade, for example, disagreeing with the nobility and wanting to go out there on their own, at their own risk, right, but sometimes so boldly that was also a matter for the knights not to lose face. Like, say, these guys are actually going ahead without cover, without our own support, against an entire complete host of cavalry and infantry on their own. Well, this is crazy. And from the other side, this made the news, also because these were all successful battles, eventually, for the side that also used infantry, in which the commoners decided to act that way, that resounded far and wide across Europe. I really want to stress this, how traumatically fast communications were in the Middle Ages, contrary to the Dark Age mythology, etc. That I think if you have a severe mental illness, I think you can still believe as something that can be called a fully developed human being. There's thus an arc in which you can trace the development of infantry. This sort of, for different regions, there is a moment you can measure for the top of infantry power and its eventual close. Because, again, essentially by the mid-14th century, whatever had been the exploit, especially in more peripheral parts of Europe, of infantry for all different reasons, mostly political, this sort of comes back. But you really had to wait until the mid-15th century, so another century before infantry was properly created through another model. By the way, it was completely broken also of political autonomy, right? Because, well, even in the Confederacy, indeed, that was not just some cantons were forming a league, whatever. This was all a much bigger system that with much greater resources. Fairly big country, as a matter of fact, and the only exception of some sort of communal origin for that, pike squares were be invariably the product of essentially salaried proletarians, so if you want to call them like that, under the firm control, at least for the Landsknecht, and the problem was the money for everybody, telling the truth. But of course, in that sense, the German empires were not among the most performing there, but firmly otherwise and univocally produced by the great princes, right? The great princely authorities, monarchic states, telling the truth, of Europe, right? So looking at those arcs we're talking about, say, I don't know, the Scottish infantry of the wars of Scottish independence, so to say, or the pretty narrow window, actually, of Flemish infantry between a few years, really. Kortrijk and Mons-en-Pévèle, right? You can look at the Ditmachers, it's sort of more scattered across time with back and forth, because, again, it's such a vastly decentralized and socially unstratified area that sort of different changes could produce this infantry upper hand in relative terms without much of a structural development. The same Swiss, right, that have a broader arc throughout the 14th century, but also end up eventually earning their own autonomy, in some ways being able to successfully defend it, at least for a while, and basically only later developing a different type of infantry. You have the English, I don't name because actually these were not commoners' armies. These were royal armies where the footmen were mostly so due to the fact that men-at-arms were dismounted. And so they were entirely dismounted, these entirely foot armies, but the core heavy element, the decisive element, was dismounted from horseback, whereas, of course, longbow and just as crossbow and other armies were the regular complement of missile troops, plus other infantry that we tend not to remember very much, but was tendentially present, in fact, especially on the wings, to actually protect the same archers. And probably those are the least represented guys, but were there. You can appreciate these arcs because, again, there are a series of battles where you understand that more or less the same people in these regions had participated to multiple clashes, right? I made an entire video last year about 70-plus armies of central northern Italy, surpassing tens of thousands of men, right? Most of them were infantry, as a matter of fact. So we're talking a total of millions of men in arms. Some were the same people, but fundamentally, by scale, we're talking hundreds of thousands. So we're talking about levels of militarization, literally, of mass society, rather. We tend to think, let's say, to underestimate perhaps how, say, participating to warfare an average commoner really was. Like if you look at 14th century France, there also wasn't really a very peaceful time for the locals. Well, the degrees of military participation, say, admittedly something sort of less temporary, less sort of very different in kind, but by population percentage within the community were higher than the Prussia of Frederick the Great. So you understand actually how important infantry was, but also how misrepresented perhaps in modern times, because we perhaps gave it too much credit, but at the same time perhaps doing too much credit according to the models developed in modernity. So this positivistic idea that infantry had to grow just because of technology and all this pile of BS, including the one of the military revolution to begin with. But because they were actually tough, and they were actually, as we've explained also in the previous video, obviously for their own core condition on the battlefield of subordination, really needing a lot of courage at least, but also capacity of resistance, as they did display on multiple occasions, knowing in fact that if they were abandoned by cavalry, they were done for. They could resist for a while, they would have been cut down to pieces. And in this sense, this tells you also how actually powerful medieval armies were and how superior cavalry was in these centuries. And it gives you a pretty sort of muscular, right, a concrete understanding also the ratio between these arms. Structural cohesion had to be obviously achieved to prevent fleeing at the first cavalry charge, right, which was, as we've seen in some of these examples already, including today, like before, did happen, right? In fact, in time, this was actually an exception, admittedly an exception. We have, unfortunately, less information about the High Middle Ages as opposed to this later period, where we actually know that infantry was actually superior in relative terms to its own condition toward cavalry in the later centuries as well. But we also don't see a great deal of properly clamorous infantry victories either, right? So it would be interesting to research better those earlier centuries to understand exactly how also knights did actually dismount more often as well. But if you start looking at the 13th, the early 14th century, you definitely see that foot soldiers were capable of mastering cavalry assaults by learning to, for example, plant their pikes firmly and to close ranks instantly. there is only one way, as you explained, to stop a cavalry charge. So very thickly packed formation of pikemen in the first ranks and guys ready in the posterior ones with bludgeoning weapons to sort of beat down cavalrymen if they, God forbid, for the infantry, knights, as they did indeed charge into the pikes, could find a way through, and that's very delicate because they would normally also be able to break through after a while, after repeated charges, after testing in the battle line. Again, knights knew extremely well what they were doing all the time. There's never a battle in which knights said, okay, well, let's charge these imbeciles of infantrymen. This is something also other YouTubers continue to parrot all the time. They knew exactly and precisely what they were doing. Most of the times they were actually successful, including in the battles in which they ultimately were defeated in. And the sense was, again, standing your ground, which was incredibly nerve-wracking, to say the least. Also because your spine could be wrecked. In any case, it would be wrecked, even if your nerves, especially if your nerves were that safe. Like, it was all a Russian roulette of sorts, standing your ground in the first ranks. But indeed, that was the only way to stop a cavalry charge, if not, with our cavalry. And it was an oddity, really, to see cavalrymen charging into infantrymen, because it was not normally the case, right? Normally, again, infantrymen were auxiliary forces. They normally didn't even took on cavalry. They normally engaged against other infantry on the wings. And the point being, indeed, that this type of formation, this type of mindset, this type of what had always been there. Right? I made a video about Pictish tactics, and hell, we know that Pictish infantry did pretty much the same against mounted opponents, including their own sort of Pictish kin. They had pretty good cavalry. Pictish tactics are incredibly interesting because they were apparently more developed than we normally would think, like at the edge of the war, for not talking about the fact that Anglo-Saxons actually did fight on horseback, and they were pretty terrifying in that function. So also they admit that there wasn't much of an equestrian tradition in England. It's true compared to the country, but it's definitely not true even for the Anglo-Saxon period, as we also have clearly depicted in different sources described as well. So there was actually nothing innovative about these tactics in the 13th and 14th century. They were the same old tactics, just armies were more developed, they were bigger, they required greater resources, greater training, larger recruitment, and so there was also much greater attention toward the whole, think about the battle array for these armies. I mean, armies could stretch literally for kilometers. It's just a matter of maths as well. They needed space. They needed to infantry and cavalry marched well aligned with one another. Cavalry center, infantry wings, and so on. You would be surprised by how well drilled infantry was in the 13th, 14th century. As we explained before, a single Italian army of 30,000 men had wings of 5,000 infantrymen that were also in great part pikemen, telling the truth, that not even once are even recorded, the sort of breaking, not being able to align themselves with infantry, and had this incredibly sophisticated combined armed tactics. And 5,000 men, which is a single wing, meaning sort of both sides you had of the actual line, you had double that. Altogether, infantry columns, infantry square of the, say, the Italian wars were normally actually smaller than that, right? So just for telling you, for the sake of perspective, how disproportionately overly advanced medieval civilization really was. It's something utterly traumatic and shocking nobody has ever discussed, right? Because people focus on their own national history. They just look, in some cases, as it happened especially in Northern Europe, there were fewer, smaller armies. So that's medieval warfare. No, right? Medieval civilization was something unspeakable, well within the scale of the classical one, including for the level of military professionalism. Who doesn't understand this? It's just simply wasting his life, basically. This is reflected exactly cavalry. As we explained, cavalry routinely charging to pikes, right? That's what they did. Like, if they charge into infantry, it's because infantry had pikes, right, to receive them. So there is no innovation, There is a development of weapons, yes, but it's something very gradual during the 13th century. It was sort of race between the, sort of, for as far as the length of the knight's lengths and the infantry pike. Everything was sort of incredibly well calibrated for the forces on the field, but regularly, right? Heavy charge. And the thing that sort of bugs me at some point is when people say, oh, no, during the 13th century, plate armor was developed actually because you had to defend from crossbow fire. Yeah, as if, taking, a cavalry lance in the chest at a sum of 90 kilometers per hour charging into enemy pikemen was, you had to await the crossbow to defend yourself. Yeah, sure, right? This kind of rigid determinism, mechanicism, consequentialism is really stomaching, to say the least. Now, the interesting aspect of it is that obviously infantrymen were not simply, they had, in line of principle, or in spite of this eclipse of their own victory as an arm, that had also, again, I want to stress, social culture never quite happened per se, right? There had been in the past peoples, still at this point, that they actually were so poor that just they had almost all the infantry, and so even if they mostly tried to lure the enemy in ambushes, whatever, so you can't say infantry could quote-unquote win, but yes, at the fringes of the world where, nobody cared about these battles, of course. Where big war was made in the heart of Western civilization, indeed. Infantry was thus presented to a different scale of challenge, as we explained before. Say, the imperial cavalry of Frederick II at the time of the wars of the Lombard League. You have the flower of French chivalry against sort of the rebellious Flemish communes. So when you look at victories of infantry, or even just the fact that there had been infantrymen had in battle withstood like repeated cavalry charges of the enemy, then maybe their own cavalry had won the day. Like, it was not even that important. This were considered in any case major victories over the nobility due to the fact of the sort of the social and technical divide. And this condition, the breaking of this condition of moral and material subordination that the commoners had been forced into, causing, in these battles, especially when they happen in a row for a while, because there are hardly ever very close, chronologically close infantry victories. You can't simply say, okay, well, this is just simply a trail. It's a series you can absolutely chain. But the fact these things had happened, it would echo in generations, causing these communities, the community's self-esteem to soar, right? Demonstrating that battlefield success is also the ultimate booster of morale. If you know, obviously, that you can successfully beat the enemy, you will go for it. We've seen also how, even for the previous generation, there were moments where infantry wanted to enter battle, right? And the noblemen had problems in restraining them for how confident they were. So this moral thermometer had always been going up and down in a way, and every battle, every context must be very carefully measured in terms of forces involved, which is also a bit sort of a difficult thing to do in history, right? With sort of relatively scanty data and so on. But that's why moral indicators are also the most important telling the truth. Like, if you really want to study medieval warfare well, you should concentrate on this. You should concentrate, as we said before, what ignited these people's motivation and beliefs and whatever. It's not the technical aspect, arms and armor, literally the least important thing in the whole picture, right? Nobody cared about this, right? The only time this thing start kind of mattering in a relevant sense is mid-14th century, when there is this kind of also shrinking of the papal and imperial universal force, so that there is a provincialization of the world where this is happening in different countries. Think about the Swiss voyage, or even the same longbow in England. It became a symbol of the middle class, right, in different ways. And also given the later Third Estate revolution of the 17th century, magnified, and later, I don't know, sort of St. Churchill would sort of magnify the longbow as if it was the fruit of some level of technological advancement parallel to 19th century British industrial revolutions with some case. So always be careful with history, and especially try to realize that the more back you go in time, and sort of the bigger the engagements, the more balanced the odds really are, right? The more similar forces really are, right? You can't look at the English and French armies of the Hundred Years' War and pretending that they weren't the same armies. As a matter of fact, right? This typical modernistic mental illness to conceptualize everything, right? Not to draw a pattern, not to see the sort of the entire picture is something utterly frightening. If it wasn't also so ridiculous. Now, these patterns recur widely, for example, at least in all across Europe, not specifically for the Flemish. This started, in fact, after Courtrai in French, if you prefer. You have tens of battles of this kind scattered all over Europe. Some are more important, some not. Again, Courtrai is big, especially in terms of moral impact. It was objectively sort of the path opener in a moral sense. The chronological order is important because we explained this never happened in men's memory. At the time, you have Bannockburn in Scotland, among the many, of course. This was most famously the 1314 engagement in which Robert Bruce's skilterns shattered the English army of Edward II. And there are some other instances, for example, the Liège forces at Votem in 1346, that is indeed very close to sort of the general idea of the Low Countries. As such, this was actually a Walloon community, weren't Flemish, so you... as I often say, like after Mons-en-Pévèle until Guinegate, the Flemish just get beaten all the time by cavalry. But you see, indeed, this case, doesn't matter how heavily fortified the Walloon infantry really was against the Prince Bishop of Liège. It was an sort of local clashes interscene here, but they fought in open field and they entrenched themselves well. These prepared fortifications, luring also for that reason, exactly because they were just outside the suburbs of the city. The Prince Bishop's army was still in three battle lines. This is very similar again to Crécy itself, right? If you think about it, and they lost, they failed. 57 knights only, admittedly. The Prince, which was not few, right? Prince Bishop. Lost, but it's also considered that they were in great numerical inferiority compared to the Walloons, and so there are different places. Again, Liège there had been historically some infantry capacities from these towns, etc. But these are all relatively scattered examples, right? It's difficult, as we were saying, to simply draw an arc from speaking of the very same communities at a time, right? So you can't always find, especially smaller engagements in which, but not so easily or frequently, right? But indeed, it's interesting that in this more frontier area, you do have this kind of, we can explain, in theory, why that is the case. This is not exactly the video why, I should also because it's very long, and I don't think we're going to finish this now, even this evening. But indeed, if the places are less, they have a weaker authority in general, like the northwestern space, say in between Low Countries, the Holy Roman Empire, etc. You do have potentially this greater communal sort of autonomization. It's true for the Litmash, it's true for the Swiss, it's true for the Scots. In fact, pity for Schwerpunkt for me to have never made a full video series about the Scottish Wars of Independence. I made a video about the Battle of Stirling Bridge, admittedly, it's a very beautiful and important battle. This was not the opening battle of the wars, but the first Scottish victory. I would like to stress that just prior to that, the English had sort of obliterated the year before a Scottish infantry force. So it's never just about infantry force per se, it's also obviously how we employ that and what happens during the battle. As you know, at Bannockburn, where on June the 23rd, 24th, 1314, the Scottish skilterns, because there are interesting preparatory maneuvers, including a Scottish infantry force that parried an English flank attack at a strategic level right before the battle, but you have this densely packed circular or rectangular, depending there was apparently circular, but there's a debate, or rectangular formations of spearmen standing several ranks deep with long pikes presented outward. You have the English, like vultures, with their cavalry touring around the circles, apparently, to spot which was, in fact, the weakest spot, and their, again, pikemen on the outer ranks, very, very firm. All the sort of general rabble that could do something inside the circle, moved along the inner perimeter in parallel with the English, so to provide the toughest resistance possible in case knights charge into that. And the Scottish skill term, by the way, doesn't have any specific meaning. It doesn't mean a circular formation. It obviously comes from shield, and it has just to do with the idea of a bit of a shield wall, even though shields do not make the defense, just spikes do. So it's a bit of a misnomer among other misunderstandings that is continually spawned in pop culture. This formation first repelled English cavalry probes on the first day, and then advanced on the second day to destroy Edward II's army in the confined ground between the Bannockburn and the river fort, where the English knights could not deploy freely. The Battle of Waltham, we just sort of highlighted them, was fought on July the 19th, 1346, near Liège, so this urban militias of the local town and their allies from the surrounding good towns defeat a coalition of the prince bishop and neighboring nobles, temporarily shifting, at least temporarily, the balance of power inside the prince bishopric and demonstrating the capacity of trained communal infantry to operate without knightly leadership. It was a bit sort of this low country prerogative as well, for the reason we were hinting at. The Low Countries had a long history of, and also northwestern Germany in general, there was a bit of a continuum, as you know, in decentralization, right? In lack of central authority, and so also gradual feudal fading, especially during the 13th century, where these instead communes sort of developed. Like, this is the last spark of any such greater development of infantry in the region, that otherwise, in fact, would never find basically a decent army by sort of competitive standards until, as I also made a video some few months ago, basically the Dutch army of the late 17th century. Never even think that the Dutch army of the 80 Years' War was anything particular. On the contrary, it was sort of very primitive and underdeveloped compared, especially to the Spanish one. Now, knights recognized the battlefield expertise of their adversaries. They understood that warfare demanded fresh approaches. They were by far the most intelligent, the most adaptable. They literally saw what this was all about. They could test better. They had a much greater military experience to begin with. These commoners, that we list here from these battles, went at war every once in a while, really. Maybe just once in these biggest battles in their times. It would be, I don't know, town watchmen or something like that. But they could sort of witness to scorched or tactics. They could go out there. They knew the violence, the brutality of life. Like, warfare wasn't even that sort of big of a deal compared to what normally happened at this point in history. But that was kind of a great component, if anything, from a psychological point of view. So this is an interesting aspect of the story, that even though you would not be involved in warfare, nor you were greatly expected to do great deeds, because you were just a freaking militiaman, right? You went at war literally with your war tools, or even if you were actually better armed, as it did happen, especially as society started to become more oligarchic, like you hadn't picked up those weapons but up to the day before, right? The fact that overall society was so violent, the fact that war was so ubiquitous, that you always lived in, whichever community was always involved in some kind of warfare, in some kind of political debate that would normally escalate into violence and bloodshed, already set your entire existence, your entire mindset, your entire horizons on the basis of this brutality of combat. That was also pretty self-evident. Right? It was much easier to die in general, so just combat was much more influenced by that. Try to replicate that in, I don't know, HEMA today. It's something just you don't go at an enemy in the same way because of that. And knights were obviously the champions of the situation. They realized that that infantrymen not only held their ground under charge, but routinely secured terrain advantages, marshes, ditches, and prepared obstacles that heavily penalized mounted troops by slowing or unhorsing them. And this was routinely used throughout all warfare, including the one in which a mounted one was dominant. Exactly in the same ways, right, that we see emerging in this later time, where also incidentally we have better documentation. The ups and downs in this sort of the broader ups and downs of the interrelation between cavalry and infantry are definitely true. They're not like, I don't know, we don't know what happened before, so maybe infantry was stronger than we think. It may be true, say, in a at a superficial level. I mean, also at a core level, but say not in the sense that we're missing any major infantry development at some point in the early Middle Ages. All right, if anything, again, infantry was still more relevant in relative terms, like compared to what would become later. Later would be actually more important in absolute terms, as I'm explaining here. Like knights knew better how to use that, and also how to use it against other knights. In fact, the battles of Courtrai, Mons-en-Pévèle were all directed by the counts of Flanders, even though their armies were basically just made up of commoners. And in fact, in Flanders, this dynamic stands out clearly between 1302 and 1304. Right, you have this beautiful passage from the Historia Fiorentina of Villani that says, quote, "So proud and undaunted were the Flemings after the victory at Courtrai that one Fleming with his Godendag was not afraid to take on 2 mounted French knights." Naturally, Villani here is exaggerating a little bit. He also says something very beautiful and very terrible at the same time. That, namely, the French considered the Flemish bunnies made of butter, right? For telling you how meek and sort of weak, generally speaking, the Flemish in general and their communes were considered in a sense. So much so that this battle is actually, in this hyperbole here that the Florentine chronicler uses, after having apparently been after sort of been on the battlefield of Courtrai the day after. I think it was Courtrai itself, because he was involved in trade in Flanders, etc. Is part of this broader statement, like, this is impossible. It's like a word upside down. It's such a bizarre battle. Like they wouldn't read at the time anything systemic per se. They kind of realized it later. This was as we said before, the first major sort of infantry victory. At this point, it would repeat themselves. It was seen as a sort of mark of times, but in general, even for the fact that these were Flemish, they were considered like, what? Against the French? Really? They're literally the best knights out there. Giovanni Villani was, as you know, a Florentine merchant and official who served as prior of Florence. He ruled the city for a while, compiled his Nuova Cronica on the basis of commercial correspondence and travelers' reports from the Low Countries. It was full of Italians there, including, by the way, and this is recorded probably spurious, but it's also very historically plausible for telling you how much the Flemish also cared about Italian warfare, and probably they were greatly inspired by that in the previous centuries. That they claimed that Castruccio, that also made a video on a couple of months ago, famous Italian Lucchese condottiere, this was also mostly famous because of Machiavelli's biography of the model of a great prince, a bit sort of altered, but Derrick was a hell of a military commander. If you look at Alto Pascio, had been involved apparently in these wars, right, where Italian infantry was actually superior even to the Flemish one. The French had hired that exactly to counter the Flemish one. There are beautiful passages about the rout of Terouanne from the same source here. Some comments reflecting the fact, for example, the Italians had the so-called gialde, that were some much longer pikes than the ones that the Flemish used. It tells you again how this abyss also in civilizational development between northern and southern Europe. And the Flemish wanted to claim themselves, this is spurious, that Castruccio had been fighting there, had been in Flanders, right? And this is a 15th century Flemish source, by the way, not even a current one. It actually doesn't even speaks even of Spanish and Italian mercenaries, but sort of does. These were hired indeed by Philip IV. But just for telling you how relevant this is, right? This account of Flemish events doesn't much reflect contemporary Italian perceptions of northern infantry effectiveness, but rather sort of the bizarre nature of this kind of communal infantry of townsmen, of third estaters. These were not city-states like the ones that the Italians were habituated to, were really full-fledged armies that were as big or even superior, actually, at this point, to the ones of, say, France and England at large. But in this sense, the paradox, right, of how these, again, bunnies made of butter could inflict this traumatic blood-letting, right, the entire shock produced by the defeat of the very flower of French chivalry at the hands of these guys that, again, went to war with Godendags, so to say. There's all sort of history of the Godendag that probably wasn't even called like that. It was like the stuff. Courtrai, we I narrated it again last video, but it's sort of a very unique battle in itself. By September 1302, the Flemish communal army, so this open field offensive against the royal forces of France, because these were the three cities like Ghent, Ypres, Brugge that were sort of rising, right, with the support of the Counts of Flanders that were vassals of the French. They were probably within the Kingdom of France, right, institutionally, politically, territorially. Pre-battle enthusiasm reached a fever pitch. Apparently, the men of Ghent feeling exceptionally joyful and performing communal round dances in the streets and camps. You would be surprised by how frequent this stuff was, really, not just among infantry. These were told by Veltem. As we'll see, we'll learn the source now. And the nights, for example, between a battle line engagement and another, they apparently enjoyed tournament played by the newly knighted youth, right, on the field of battle. On the 17th and 22nd of September, the Flemings again prepared for action with maximum zeal under William of Jülich, a charismatic German noble related by marriage to the Flemish comital house, who provided energetic leadership in the field. This was really a charismatic and capable commander who pressed fiercely for an assault on the king's army. We're told here again that there are different sources. You can read the Annales Gandenses, beautiful source. Many of you ask me for primary sources. It's sort of notorious if you're familiar with the times and places. William of Jülich is, again, this central figure. He was the son of Count Gerhard II of Jülich and a granddaughter of Count Guy of Dampierre. Arrived in Flanders in 1302 and quickly assumed a leading role in the field armies, coordinating the contingents of Ghent, Brugge, and Ypres. The Annales Gandenses, written by a Ghent Franciscan, supply independent confirmation of the high morale of the urban contingents in this month and their readiness to seek battle in the open as well. So you see, as a community, this is a political statement. This is what warfare is fundamentally. It's not much about who these people were, but it mattered, let's say, but not in a strictly military sense, right? It was all one with them, politically, socially, how they could and would fight, but it was a product more of the broader circumstances, not much of the fact that they used Göden dogs, and in any case, they used pikes to stop frontal cavalry charges. Philip the Fair, Philip IV of France, whose determination to absorb Flanders into a royal domain had triggered the War of 1297 and 1305, deliberately avoided an engagement at this point and unwilling to risk bloody hand-to-hand fighting by frontal charges against so formidable a Flemish host, or at least one that could really create problems. It was a pretty big army. Like we're talking, Verbruggen gives it at 8 to 10,000 men, right? So it's not enormous, right? But again, as I've said before, the French, in this case, so the top monarchic, knightly, feudal authority, knew perfectly well this was a dangerous host, right? The same Philip IV actually would risk his life at Mons-en-Pévèle. He got almost himself killed on that occasion. His knights instead employed mock frontal pressures together with genuine flank and rear maneuvers designed to disorder the dense ranks. Confronted by this, the Flemings, like the Scots and Swiss, formed a crown-shaped perimeter, bristling with defensive hedges of pikes, lances, and gun dogs, against which French cavalry could achieve only minor and largely ineffective feints that failed to break the interlocking weapons. In facing the massive Flemish formations, the knights sought to wear down the infantry by compelling them to stand all day in full battle readiness under heavy armor without food or drink. Right? This was a strategy already contemplated before Courtrai, and it was also pretty effective. It happened many times. We've seen it even at the Battle of Adrianople, for example, the negotiations between the Romans and the Tervingian Goths, and outlined in part by the contemporary chroniclers Louis of Feltham of Brabant and Giovanni Villani of Florence. In fact, you can literally go read them on this passage, on this event. Philip IV's Flemish policy formed, also see their perspective as well, a broader program of extending direct royal control over the great fiefs of the north and and West, including the attempts to absorb the County of Flanders through marriage alliances and military pressure. The same combination of feigned attacks that we've seen here and logistical attrition reappeared in later French operations against dense infantry formations in the 14th century. The French reused these. We don't talk here so much about Courtrai because, again, I discussed it in the previous part of the video. You can check that out. And I have an entire video, by the way, about the Battle of Courtrai reconstructed from primary sources. So, you have the whole picture. Fairly simple, but very interesting battle and pretty bloody one as well. And that's typically what Clausewitz and von Clausewitz would say. These are some of the bloodiest clashes because he says if two armies attack one another, you're actually going to have less losses overall in general because they're all more insecure about what they're doing. When there's a defender and attacker, that's the bloodiest engagement. It isn't just in the interest of casualty rate. It's concentrated, it's shocking, it's whatever. And so when you have cavalry against infantry, given that cavalry can only attack as a matter of fact, so infantry will defend, it's going to be bloody. Also at Courtrai from both sides, because the French did actually break in half the phalanx, even though it was behind ditches and whatever. So just for telling you that, definitely the French knights knew their deal. Even when they could also sort of make a wrong choice, like, for example, not considering, or at least not overestimating their capacity to break the phalanx and the reserve that had been placed by the Council of Flanders behind to exactly sort of stamp the French breakthrough. That's actually why they lost. Now, the French also reused these methods after later setbacks. In Mons-en-Pévèle, the refined technique combined with the tactical deployment of smaller units of crossbowmen and dismounted men-at-arms brought success to French arms, mostly also because of the fact that they managed to reform in another position. Yet, the victory remained sufficiently ambiguous, in fact, to render definitive conclusions risky. Right? More than else, at Mons-en-Pévèle, the Flemish successfully repelled the French, but didn't box them as at Courtrai, where there was a ditch, there was a canal, actually, properly, passing there. And they actually make the foolish mistake as a mono-arm, non-professional force to basically break the ranks and chase the French that have actually regrouped, and they launch a counterattack. And so basically this ends in a bloody stalemate. Right, Philip IV barely escaping with his life from the initial clash. The sense also that after, especially during the 100 Years' War, so during the peak of the crisis, also the mid-14th century, knights after this early 14th century period would abandon pitched battles in favor of chevauchés and sieges whenever possible, is not entirely real. Right, more than else, given that again armies were smaller. And also more territories depended on them because there were less resources, like less manpower, less resources in general. You would be a bit more cautious, but also armies would tend to entrench more, right? There was probably no strategic reason. It was the same strategic awareness. These things did not really change. They fought all the time. They perfectly knew what they were doing. Had they been sort of transposed across the generations in the same context, they would have probably done the same, right? So let's not magnify, but here everything changed from a day to another. Absolutely not, right? And especially as far as these matters were concerned. Now, the Flemish foot soldiers, by contrast, retain absolute self-assurance and never shunned combat, even marching out to attack at Cassel in 1328. This was the crushing French. That's the price you have to pay for this. Again, courage gets you killed. Like it's courage alone. That's the best way to send people in mid-grinder, and that's it, not to win wars, right? Courage must be accompanied by all a set of very specific, precise, combined and calibrated means that also a commander must use. It's not courage that wins wars per se. And Cassel was this pretty heavy blow inflicted by the French that, in fact, crushed the coastal peasant revolt of 1323-1328, also showing that, indeed, you can win a battle with infantry, then you can't be steamrolled and lose the war entirely, like in this case. The revolt of maritime Flanders had begun in 1323 as a tax protest against the heavy impositions levied to pay the indemnity owed to France. But this is well after the engagement, so of course of 20 years before, also in a political sense. The French had already sort of maintained their own control of the region. We're talking about an indemnity assured, at least after the Treaty of Athis-sur-Orge. This revolt had rapidly escalated into a full-scale social war against the commensal administration and the urban patriciates of Broek and Yeppe. Basically, this is where the Flemish destroyed themselves, right, from the within. What happened? They're incredibly ugly, like crazy Fourth Estate radicals backed by Third Estate ideologues having their own system collapse right in the face of the French completely. It's not like they couldn't win, by the way. That's the worst part of that. That's also what happens to the Jacquerie. It's happened to the Hussites. Practically every single instance of sort of lower estates revolt in the Middle Ages gets much worse. Like this is true also for throughout other times in history, exactly for those who had sort of contributed to enacting it and brought much worse people to power. The royal army here under Philip VI crushed the rebels at Cassel on August the 23rd, 1328, restoring order, but leaving deep social resentment, in fact, that continued to shape Flemish politics for decades. The Valois Burgundians will take care of that, as the Valois were sort of preoccupied with much bigger issues, including the same Burgundians for that matter at the point. In Scotland, likewise, infantry morale surged after the massive victory of 1314 at Bannockburn was by far the most important. We have Thomas Gray of Heaton that we remembered in the previous video. Quote, the Scots had become so courageous and spirited that they conquered the border counties and the English did not dare wait for them. Right. And in the Scala Chronica by Ethan says, again, quote, such was their superiority that they scarcely gave the enemy a thought. This naturally was for broader strategic reasons. As the Scots matured as a fully fledged feudal monarchy, they obviously had their own cavalry. But as you know, infantry, they had always had it, but in consistent terms, because during the wars of Scottish independence, indeed the Scots basically fought just with virtually entire foot armies, right? 'Cause socially, they had that. They had to make mass against the English elite. So that was the only way. Besides, again, if you defend, it's because you don't have the upper hand in a military sense. By 1327, and not even from a moral point of view, again, that's the most important fact. By 1327, the Scots still held the operational initiative and earned praise for their martial vigor from Jean le Bel in his Chronique. Thomas Gray also has something again to say about this. Scottish military dominance nevertheless faded before sort of innovative English tactical adjustments as well. You don't really have, this is very interesting, you don't have a continuous model of infantry victories in Scotland either. Indeed, in the mid-14th century, deeply undermines that sort of semi-free peasantry that somehow had gathered exactly also to some level of autonomy under what they were increasingly recognizing, in fact, as a broader monarchic order, right, to save the country from English invasion. Although the English charges at Falkirk failed against stubborn Scottish infantry in 1298, the battle in which Wallace's Skilterns held firm until broken by concentrated archery and cavalry attack, Welsh archers loosed arrows with such deadly effect that the dense Skilterns suffered catastrophic casualties from the continuous volleys as well. That's where the English were testing their missile power, and indeed that's what you have to do. It's combined arm tactics. It's not like archers destroyed the Skiltern, but they softened up enough for cavalry to charge into them. And even there, the English start preferring this masses of longbowmen, not because they were particularly different from other countries. They had also crossbowmen for that matter. As we've seen at Poitiers, it may have well been more crossbowmen than longbowmen there. But they just had them. They used them for this purpose, and it worked, right? At Bannockburn, those archers were not properly deployed, and England suffered a crushing defeat, proving how important combined arm tactics really are, how these armies mutually support one another. Yet, after extensive trial and error, refined tactics secured victories, as we have seen also in the videos about Edward III's army, right? And thanks to his genius, the greatest one, the most complete one in English history as well. At Dublin Moor in 1332 and Halidon Hill the year after, endowing English bowmen. At that point, they weren't the protagonists of this, but at least they developed this profound self-belief that underpinned their early successes in the 100 Years' War against the French nobility, at least, again, from their own perspective. We don't have any evidence that sort of longbowmen, of course, had any decisive role in these battles. But the fact that, of course, they were part of it, that they were necessary for gaining victory still, like, made them see it as themselves as the tip of the balance. There is really nothing much sort of socially uplifting about the English armies of the 100 Years' War. Like, nothing really in England changed much for the freedom, the liberty of peasants. They actually had slightly worse conditions than the rest of the West. I also made videos about this. So the entire myth that, again, this is an infantry victory in the sense there were the commoners, the footmen. This is undeniable. It's a narrative pushed in a sort of British historiography at some point during the peak of liberalism, of democracy. It's actually made up. Like, the English longbowman functioned as any other missile infantry there, was surely protagonistic, like all the others, right? And probably had nothing to do, even speaking of the weapons that they used, with having the latter as a decisive element of the wall. Had they had crossbows, actually, it would have been the same. But so people are always gullibly into believing that it was all about longbowmen, man. No, it wasn't about longbowmen. Right? It is definitely, like, you can't say, okay, look at what happened against the French, of course. But aside from the particular problems that the French had, and the Scots, that in any case won their own independence, just like the French won the 100 Years' War, so-called 100 Years' War. They had just infantry. That's not a good thing. That's a very negative thing by medieval standards to take the field just with infantry. It speaks of radical weakness. That's also why they had to be reduced in the defensive, because that was also the only thing they could do. That's also why the English dismount during the 100 Years' War. They were in smaller numbers. They didn't think they were to win. They weren't simply sort of pre-arranged to fight on foot, per se, right? Had they had the upper hand, they would have fought mounted, right? Exploiting the defensive with infantry at that point is the better option. And it's not always, also for the aftermath of the battle, the best one, because you can't properly chase the enemy, for example, if you don't have an adequate mounted force for doing that. At Falkirk, that we mentioned before, where on July the 22nd, 1298, Edward I's combination of cavalry and massed longbow fire destroyed William Wallace's Skilterns after Scottish cavalry had fled the field. Other sort of something that you want to notice in terms of combat psychology and how you can leave all the... And this is important because indeed the Scottish nobility, there was this kind of rank status solidarity also across Europeans. Like, nobility at some point prefers to emerge overall internationally at the expenses of the commoners, right? William Wallace was sort of a relatively inconvenient figure in some sense. There was a lot of debate in this chronically fragmented, in this sense crippled Scottish establishment on an international political level. They were just being recognized internationally as a proper national monarchy, right? So you have this kind of events. Cavalry does not want, leaves these infantry. That might have been alone the tip of the balance for the English victory. And you can read, therefore, also the development of same English armies in different ways, right? One could say that the lessons of that engagement were imperfectly applied at Bannockburn, but systematically refined under Edward III's commanders at Dublin Moor and Halidon Hill, establishing a tactical system of combined arms later exported to France in the campaigns of the 1340s and 1350s. But the truth is that these English armies were just what they were, right? And hadn't these battles happened, likely they would have just developed in the same identical way, right? Systemically speaking, what kind of other options were there? What kind of other change there was? Like people are generally fixated with the idea, oh, no, it's all about the longbow. It's all about, English armies, unique. They were just like the other ones in Europe. Like there was literally in their core organic and tactical components, like the same identical armies, right? And then the way they were used show how these armies were also adaptable per se, but it's something that also, in fact, you can't find elsewhere happening. There's a very interesting battle that was fought in 1340 at Lucca between the Florentines and the Pisans, where the Pisans do something very similar, right? They really await like this battle still with the battle lines in depth, and 1341, and the last battle, the Pisans are actually taking blows. The last battle line is at the mouth of their own camp, right? There are trenches, there are some peasant crossbow and pretty darn good on the flanks on this ramparts of these ditches along the aligned with the field fortifications, and the Florentine cavalry is literally stopped. We're told that the cavalry charge was halted because of how heavy the arrow fire, the crossbow, the quarrel fire really was, right? Obviously, hadn't there been cavalry also in the center, as always, the Florentines would have would have won, right? Crossbowmen could not do that alone. Before telling you how this idea of bottling an enemy formation into some sort of killing zone, whatever, it was there all over Europe. There's really nothing unique about this. They fought all in the same way. And especially the bigger the battle, the engagement was. We can read a passage from Jean Lebel about the aforementioned Battle of Ottem in 1346. These are the inhabitants of Liège winning the major victory. Say, quote, after this battle, they became so haughty that they did not wish for peace that year and refused to discuss any reasonable proposal. All good cities and the surrounding country became their allies, and they carried on the war for the whole year. Which is, again, for some places, relatively normal, right? Of course, they basically, this means as communal armies of third estators, they didn't even count as a true field army, right? Everything went so well for them that they could not have wished anything better. It's so simple if you think about it. This Gaillet talks about this as well. In fact, they went on. What you want to appreciate here is also partially the hubris of the Teutonic elements of society. From the same sources, we know that they captured the castles of Clermont and Aman, though troops loyal to the Prince Bishop and the Count of Lodz defeated them the following year at Valais. So you may want to remember, next to Ottem, the fact that even there hadn't been much structurally lasting about this third estators, townsmen. These are townsmen. They're not city-states. There's something very different, right? They're not real, even field armies in a broader sense by sort of the surrounding also power standards. Gaillet that we mentioned, by the way, is a modern study of Liégeois military organization. It demonstrates that the urban militia, the Prince Bishopric, developed this because they were the same people. You see, they were fighting just here, so some sort of social clash, right? Toward probably just a couple of years before the Black Death, showing also because of that distress. Because this was not emerging out of, oh, we are so a proud city, let's go to war, yeah, let's do that. These people were angry. They wanted to kill others, right? They didn't want the Prince Episcopal authority. And that's what causes, at the end of the day, the high degree of tactical cohesion in this mid-14th century. Nothing particularly qualitative, just moral forces that are also destroyed the year after, or not enough the year after, against the same enemy. That's also what you want to appreciate, just that like Courtrai. The French eventually steamrolled the Flemish throughout all the entire following 2 centuries. So where did this infantry force go in the region? Here, if anything, it's important in case of the Walloons of Liège is that they operated independently of knightly leadership as well, and for extended periods to sustain campaigns that challenged the traditional authority of the bishop and the regional nobility. That's important, but also short-lived and somehow within the norm of the bigger system Europe was. So what you want to appreciate from a moral point of view is that despite such setbacks, the Flemings, Scots, and Liégeois refused to allow losses to break their spirit, preserving total faith in infantry forces and later renewing the wars. Right? Every once in a while, the Flemish rebelled, and that's also how every once in a while, every time they tried, actually, they were steamrolled by the Valois Burgundy. Didn't end well. Look at what happened on Rosabecca. Look at what happened on the Irish Rebellion. I made an entire series about Burgundian warfare if you're interested in that. But what mattered for these communities, and that's where also the psychological element, the cultural, the anthropological one, is that they kept vivid memories of the earlier triumphs they had once gained, right? In periods when they had thus enjoyed clear tactical advantage, not even just because they had won, but because they had taken the field sometimes. They had made their stand. It was a political statement. So you can't encroach on our rights, even though at the end of the day that would happen. It was all a pretty shady business. Again, here, actually the social background of all this is pretty terrible. But that's, again, what they cared about. So you have this landmark clashes that stick to the regional identity. Courtrai, Bannockburn, Morgarten for the Swiss. Morgarten was sort of crucial, the 1315 Swiss victory over Habsburg forces that marked the emergence of the forest cantons as a military power of sort with. And battles like these were routinely commemorated as celebrated milestones in national histories, as we were describing before, also as almost the gradual substitute of a universal authority, but naturally the much smaller way, in the sense also a bit rigged by bias, were being engraved properly in the national consciousness of these four. And this is interesting because you see today we talk about these battles. Bannockburn was really important. Also Courtrai, so, but say there are other infantry victories that were remembered just because they were infantry victories, because moderns are obsessed with footmen and democracy and all this stuff. But actually, at the time, if you had to ask what were the more important battles of the year, there were many others, much more important ones, much more settling ones. But since infantry did not win anything there, or was maybe even superior to these other infantries, but fully integrated with the broader army, like, no, we don't think about that. Who cares after all, right? This is why modernity sucks so much. Or at least there is no modernity, but it's lack of traditional understanding, lack of military, of strategic education, really. Morgarten is yet another battle to behold. Again, I partially covered this in those videos about the Swiss Habsburg Wars. Morgarten on November the 15th, end of the season, 1315, a force from the forest cantons of Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden ambushed a Habsburg army under Duke Leopold I in a narrow alpine pass above the Egerisee, using the steep terrain and rolling logs and stones to negotiate the advantages of heavily armored cavalry, and thereby establishing the military reputation of the Swiss, at least as masters of mountain warfare. Right? This was, again, ambush warfare. Like, made an entire video about the ambush from a broader military, military logical point of view. These things did happen, all right? And they weren't so, again, frequent. As we said before, this could happen because Swiss was somehow a fringe territory, and also, in this sense, a more difficult ground. They had some reinforced strategic relevance as communities as they controlled the alpine passes that they had been endowed with since the time of the Swabians between Germany and Italy. So that's why the Habsburgs went there. It's not just to defend their honor, as some Swiss lands were. So what became Swiss lands were in fact Habsburg, part of the sort of broader Swabian duchy. But again, this was worth fighting and dying for, except, again, the Swiss here do hold an advantage. The fact that they're ambushing the army is because, actually, and as we've seen in those wars, you see, we remember these battles, but if you study the campaigns, you see that basically Habsburg at some point could simply march with an army into Switzerland, and the Swiss would not want to give battle because it was too much for them. It was too strong of an army. And we're talking even not such big armies, right? We just pinpoint the battle. But if you look at that, the Habsburgs had also much more important things to think about in the East and elsewhere. And so you can restore a bit more of actual sort of scale to the objective military relevance of these battles in the bigger picture. I mean, ambushing, say for example, this battle in Switzerland was not as important as the wars of the Scottish independence, the major ones. They were not as important as the ones of the 100 Years' War, right? They were mostly provincial clashes, right? There were many others, right, that we don't remember, right? You know what kind of battles happened at this point? I don't know, in Poland, they did happen, right? But nobody cares about. Right? Why? Because, of course, also Switzerland has a different weight in European culture through the centuries, etc. But there is also a mythology of that, right? Almost a legendary character. It's beautiful. Like, it's all stunning. These battles give you a true idea, even through the stereotype or the archetype, in fact, how truly the Middle Ages were the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages were much more similar to what the image that was made of them in the 19th century than what has been deconstrued during the 20th century. And these are some of the places of election. Think about William Tell, that is a legend that still gives you an idea of what that world war was and how also this legend was impacted in European culture as a whole, not just in the Swiss one. But there, it's an ambush. Right, this is not a proof of infantry resistance in open field, like at Laupen, for example. So that's why you have to take this always carefully in the merit of the individual clash. Yet, the moral force of this, like having defeated the Habsburgs, having successfully ambushed them, emboldened them. It was not even about the type of combat per se that mattered, the tactics, but it's the fact that they had, as the Swiss defeated the Habsburgs, effective infantry, maintained stringent internal discipline, at least for commoners' standards, which, remember, were not professional. There were some professional elements, also sort of communal armies across Europe, but in this case, everything was much more relatively down the line, egalitarian, especially by the Third Estate-run systems. There were always knights, right? The Swiss Confederacy had them. They ruled, they were present, they trained, they did supervise. So that, if anything, they were the ones, as we've seen before, so with the Count of Jülich. And these guys got themselves killed in the front line of these battles to properly spirit the infantry, to inspire them, right? That's how aware of of infantry potential they were. So even though they were ultimately victories that definitely weighted heavily on, say, feudal powers, whatever, they were quite disastrous. But at the same time, there was always some kind of knightly supervision of this, right? That those were the experts in the art of war. That's what the same commoners wanted to be guided by, right? There is thus all a different level of sort of quote-unquote national, social, political, whatever, overlapping factors that also brought to the victories as opposed to weapons per se. And so there's this capacity of commoners, especially in the first half of the 14th century, to show they could get into the fray. Again, the period after this breaks mostly their demographics in many ways, especially their wealth. So later there's a lot of infantry development, to say the least. The same Swiss do that, but because there are some powers that can pay for that, there are the richest parts of the league that take more power. So it's a completely different system. It's not like the freeman, so to say, the rustic or the burgher that goes out there on his own with people that he lived next to. No, those were somehow increasingly professional troops, integrated through much more organized systems, by greater authority, higher authority, in a more impersonal way. But it's this cohesion, this esprit de corps, especially at the beginning, that constituted the infantry corps' secret of victory. The gathering of battlefield loot was strictly forbidden, also to prevent these unreliable commoners to break and to loot. Right, some of them broke, as we've seen, as soon as knights arrived. So there was this increasing effort at controlling society, of regulating it, imposing authority, discipline, and so on. This gradually develops. That's how, again, the Swiss start from sort of ambushes in the mountains to going to to open field, in fact, open field armies to crush the Burgundian forces out there. So you really want to appreciate that. Not losing was present also as a measure in many, all the other armies for that matter as well. So it's definitely not the winner per se. This was an order issued both to the Flemings at Courtrai, the Swiss soldiers after Sempach, yet another important battle. The 1386 engagement in which the Swiss Confederates defeated Leopold III of Austria. You have John of Winterthur, we will read all these sources at some point. All these chronicles telling this. So because they speak of the world that so these forces operated in that is sort of more important than many other aspects. Interestingly enough, the capture of knights alive was discouraged in favor of killing them outright so that no ransom could be claimed and the formation would not be disrupted by desire for profit either, aside from all the social instances of this. Like, of course, had these prisoners provided the rebels with the communes with some level of some edge in negotiations, it would have been another story. But there was also literally this discipline issue, right? Don't take prisoners because we hate them, and generally speaking, we don't want to create splits within our opinion about it, given that we have to act as one. But also tactically, right? You don't have to rush ahead, right? For example, in front of the lines, as these guys were so cut down, because if you win, they're done for anyway. You're going to capture them anyway later. But in the moment, also, it's really risky for the formation, because it was already a miracle for third estators fourth estators alone to take the field, right, to resist the cavalry charges. We mentioned Sempach before. This was a battle fought on July the 9th, 1386, seeing the Swiss defeat a Habsburg army under Duke Leopold III. Contemporary ordinances and later chronicles emphasize the prohibition on breaking ranks for plunder, as this, again, crushing factor maintaining formation integrity against the Austrian knights who fought on foot in a dense wedge themselves, interestingly enough. So the Swiss have victories all a bit across the 14th century because nobody necessarily dislodges them from the war. They keep operating, and so they always have some useful potential. There are also other theaters. For example, Flemings, Scots, and Swiss here acquired grim reputations among their adversaries, but for example, the fierce battlefield conduct of the Irish and Welsh infantry that fought mostly as guerrilla fighters is something very different, right? Was also matched. Like they fought without expectation of quarter, and so taking prisoners, essentially. I made some videos about Irish and Welsh warfare. Perhaps we should come back on, especially on the latter, a little bit more, because I think it's in years that I don't discuss it. But we've seen what it was about. Mostly infantry warfare, as a matter of fact. They had very few cavalry. Depending also on which times, because before Edward I, they were kind of an independent nation. Then they were subdued, but were rebellions, as you know, up to the 15th century. In any case, they tended to avoid open field confrontations, or getting, also when they were crushed, to get the hell out of there, quickly coming back home, right? Trying to avoid sort of even denying they had participated, because to avoid English retaliation. There was this recognition that mercy from enemies was impossible in that circumstance as well, right, from knights, and that capture or retreat meant being trampled beneath heavy war horses or cut down by pursuing horsemen as well. Say in the woods, right, the Celtic Fringe was pretty masterful at that kind of ambushes and guerrilla, exactly because they couldn't really cope with the heavies in open field in a conventional sense, normally at least. Then, of course, by approximation, of course, they fought pretty much in the same way themselves, but their social structures were much feebler, and so that it was rarer for them to field adequate forces, right, for those roles in the first place. So also for the knights, this was a big deal. Like, depending on the enemy, you knew what to expect or not. Knights knew that third, fourth estate were sort of more rowdy and sort of despicable forces in the bigger picture, right, of society, of culture. And they acted accordingly. They were also motivated to cut them to pieces, as it did happen on multiple occasions. But the same ruthless infantry resolve naturally affected knights and armored horsemen, who responded with, again, deep hatred and fear of the common foot soldier, who refused to grant the traditional courtesies of chivalric combat. Chivalric combat did not quite exist in the ideal terms in which it's sort of literally described, but say the idea, of course, that knights were part of an establishment and they tended to negotiate on different social and cultural premises did make a difference in these gaps, in these voids of feudal royal authority, and therefore it was really a problem confronting forces that were denying, in a sense, not much the right of these monarchs to rule, but still challenging their capacity to do so, which is practically the same also in other people's eyes, right? Also in the international observers. As we said before, there was, as we've seen also from foreign accounts, these battles, it was a pretty substantial Europe-wide awareness of these, the importance of these clashes. It would be interesting to analyze in a standalone video how this somehow affected the understanding of warfare in those generations, because you don't have to underestimate the war, especially considering that these infantry victories arrived for different reasons, again, not in the core lanes of the core power lanes of Europe, so to say, at its fringes, but still they were the prelude for the big 14th century crisis that engulfed the world. So psychologically speaking, also as far as combat is concerned, like there was really a big change, right? The great medieval civilization contracts in the mid 14th century. It's a much more modern and secular thinking after all these bloodbaths that sort of, again, world upside down, the plague, these infantry victories, that while not unhinging aristocratic dominance, actually making tighter, because the ancien regime is truly born out of the bloody repression. By the way, for example, think about the Jacquerie. It happens, as we said before, will the broader sort of revolutionary movements. It had happened, as we've seen yesterday, for the Cathars. It will happen for the Hussites. There are just some lands that arrive later. Potentially the less developed lands in Europe, especially in Central Europe, Northern Europe, tend to have these tail strikes of infantry strength at a smaller scale, but later in time. But matters would overall settle in places like, I don't know, France. France is only the system that sort of tends to display much infantry power, but sort of this tendency, bigger revolt on a scale. There were some issues in Spain, but overall, the core, aside from the French, had remained unchanged, like cavalry dominated, right? As we have understood through these videos, foot soldiers function not merely as military rivals to chivalry, but frequently as social and political adversaries as well. Could have not been otherwise. A dynamic illustrated by the French knightly suppression of the carpenter Durand and his brotherhood of Capuchins in the mid-12th century, as early as that, and in Flanders by the coastal peasant revolts of 1323-1328, in which rural populations, as we've seen, refused to tolerate noble strongholds within their villages and tore them down entirely as symbols of aristocratic oppression. And they lost the war, so they had more of that, doubled down on it in different ways. Now, knightly disdain for peasants and commune residents found expression in the celebrated Karelslied of the period. Right, this is especially true, again, in the broader northwestern European space, right? For that matter, it's not just communal organization that is disdained. It's literally the estates that they represent. As we said before, like in Flanders, you have towns, fundamentally, which means that if the feudal authority that still rules over them, formally, institutionally, and is still physically there as well, with the Kingdom of France closed, it evaporates or becomes weaker, we have these infantry-only armies, because we literally don't have an aristocratic upper class, right, that leads them. the few knights that we mentioned before were really few, right? And they dismounted themselves because there was not enough cavalry, but like as we've seen in Scotland, or even against the English in absolute terms against the French, because the armies were just smaller, not because the English didn't have cavalry in that case. The English are always something different there. Remember, royal armies, not commoners. But again, if you take the Italian city-states, for example, those intermarried, the nobility, the establishment intermarried also with royalties. So it was a different story. They had knights in their service. They had even more German knights in their service that the Holy Roman Emperor had. So it's a completely different story. What matters is the estates. All right, there are differences all across these lands. I have a very interesting video that I'm preparing about the decline of the ministeriales in Germany throughout this very 13th century, later 13th century period, which also witnesses some important infantry development. The two things are just loosely related, but I mean, the idea that also society engages itself, right? That servile knight condition in Germany disappears at this point, and all these mercenaries are, however, all these knights, however, have a market crisis in Germany because the princes are taking everything over after the Great Interregnum. And so you find all those German mercenaries abroad in France, in Italy, etc., because they had to find a job. So they had to survive in some way. So you understand how complex it is. I hope that these videos are telling about the motivations, the sort of behind it, the mindset behind the helmet, so to say. The Carol's lead we just mentioned refers to the Carols, so the Charles possessing excessive self-regard and overinflated confidence in their own capacity, strutting at festivals or fairs like true lords while readily brandishing weapons. This is especially Northwestern Europe. It was all feudally and monarchically dominated. It was really ridiculous. Here we have this Kervin de Lettenhove, in fact, History of Flanders, right, that says, quoting this Carol's lead, right, quote, "To the fair he will go, he thinks himself a count. There he will destroy everything with his rusty stuff. Then he goes a-drinking wine, and once he's drunk, then all the world is his, both town and country." Right? Says, while the nobility would gladly have stripped, in fact, the peasants of personal liberties and self-rule, and the Charles in turn aimed to curb chivalric power. Says, quote, "They think of nothing but evil. I know a good fate for them. They should be dragged off and hanged. Their beards are too long. They cannot escape. They're good for nothing except under restraint." Right? It's a very beautiful, aristocratically minded poem. It literally illustrates how these people were seen as cattle, basically. Like, and this was not distant from reality, right? This was essentially communes that had achieved more wealth, more autonomy for all the reasons that we described. Also in our videos about the Low Countries that explain partially this stuff. This was completely not unheard of, but again, these individuals were the archetype of the lesser people, right? The Carol's lead, preserved in 14th century Flemish manuscripts, articulates the aristocratic stereotype of the armed peasant as both ridiculous and dangerous. Its circulation coincides with the period where urban and rural infantry, because there is this town and district, so also the peasantry obviously was co-opted, say better cowed into also by the third estaters, as we said before, as fourth estaters in the fight. But altogether, they had repeatedly demonstrated their capacity, at least in principle, to defeat noble cavalry on the battlefield and to challenge the social hierarchy that underpinned knightly dominance. Or at least, yes, to challenge, not because they erased it. On the contrary, these places do not have a future in terms of infantry development connected to political independence. Right? I mean, at least Switzerland will have it. Scotland will have it for a while in history. This is very different. This is truly third estate towns with a pretty loose, quarrelsome idea of themselves. They don't develop into some regional force of just one city hegemonizing everybody. It's something very different. And that's why they were mocked as well for this. Now, this low estimation held by Flemish nobles toward peasants and town dwellers was echoed in every land where the military efficacy of infantry brought political and social gains for commoners at the expense of aristocrats and wealthy urban burghers who had previously monopolized military and political power. And so, while indeed, and most importantly, cavalry elements, not even just occasionally, but again, regularly re-established battlefield dominance after this early, especially first half 14th century setbacks in Flanders through improved combined armed tactics, or better, like continuing their own combined armed tactics at the expense of this mono-armed hosts of infantry only that were regularly steamrolled. Their supremacy in a broader sense never recovered its former absolute historic status. It was never absolute, but indeed, a few generations before, even the idea that these people could simply take on cavalry in open field, something really even thought of, sure, already, but not really say, how do you do that, right? We've never seen it before. This really does matter for a community. Like, have you ever succeeded in doing so? That's a big question in the broader picture, because that's also what noblemen thought all the time. They continuously tested their own limits, right? Including in, for example, charging at some point in ways that are often on books, modern books, described as quote unquote reckless, but that were actually, and technically also how they would normally go at this infantry. At some point, just admit that, infantrymen at that point were strong because they were loaded enough, right? Not because there was a technicality that they had come up with the knights could not deal with. Unfortunately, technologism is always there. It's something really horrifying and really abhorrent. And so, also in a bigger sense, in the political and social spheres, common infantrymen steadily enlarged their reputation throughout Europe by securing charters, representation, territorial control. This happened at least in an uneven way, where they were mostly still under, right? There was no moment in which they ever broke free for real. Like, there were parentheses, right? Pretty short parentheses. But the idea that also in later times, like the prestige of men-at-arms and mounted warfare had been shattered, and now there were military professionals, including infantrymen, that were more like soldiers paid by the elite in charge, by the oligarchs in charge, but still, like that, for example, operating guns, starting eventually later to be equipped for especially in the much later pike and shot warfare, sort of take down cavalry and sort of marginalizing on the field, while not eliminating. At that point, princes were in charge, the aristocracy was fully in charge, and the ancien regime is fully locked in. There is nothing to do about it, no change whatsoever. Actually, the Middle Ages had witnessed much more the sense rebellism, if you can so call it. Still, of course, the old knightly ideal, say that the peak one of the 13th century, the unchallengeable one of the 13th century, was indeed scathed and gradually giving way eventually to especially pike and shot warfare, right? Never being erased. Heavy cavalry is always there. Aristocracy is always in charge, more importantly. But it's something that definitely happens in the later Middle Ages, and that must be reflected because it's not an orderly, linear, progressive, deterministic process, right? Even sort of teleologically speaking, there isn't really from the side of these communities, much of a broader horizon than the one outside of their city walls. Is especially the case for the Flemish. If you see, again, they don't start, invading Germany or France, but they remain there. What they want is just, again, as merchants to make money. That's it, right? There isn't the creation of a professional army of some regional domination. None of that. They're taken over by the Valois Burgundy after having lost the same wars against the French. So it's like this sort of sidestepping, right? Not even backstabbing, that knights must acknowledge, right, from the side of this community, and that older great imperial cathedral that the world was, like the great symbol of universal authority, never really is restored, as also indeed great universal authorities suffer a crisis. There is this problem of organizing Europe, a continent after the great crisis of the world that everybody suffers from, right? So there are lots of myths behind this. Like I've never really looked at this very much, but if, for example, if you on YouTube type to search Swiss warfare in the Middle Ages, you find all kind of cliches. The idea of elite Swiss infantry units evolving continuously without suffering major reversal, building unbreakable self-reliance together with steady territorial expansion that multiplied their military power through the incorporation of new cantons and allies. That's not how really it happened, right? It happened through an incredibly slow, grinding process of also warfare, but it's incredibly tough negotiations, internal strife, general issues with the empire, always this threat of invasion, actual invasions, with again Habsburg armies that do not get exterminated as soon as they set foot in Switzerland. They literally cross it, plunder it, whatever. So we have to be realistic about how this went, right? And so it's also completely false to think that there was an upward trajectory lasting nearly 2 centuries without defeats, right? There is also, and also when, again, there is this capacity of preservation, there are these overall successes, the Swiss are successful against the Habsburgs, right? But also never met opponents on the scale of the French or the English monarchs until at least the mid-15th century with the Burgundians in Switzerland. And there, the military model has specifically changed. Like it's not even the product of a gradual development. The Swiss army before the Battle of Arbedo was basically the same of the previous centuries. Yes, there were some slight changes, but the radical core change from that point of view, the steps up and provides the pike element to the pike and shot system as a prevalently pike manned column, not even square, by the way, yet, is this properly wanted military reform. It's one of the few cases in which military reforms start to be more, also because the development in the art of war is accelerating, is more scientifically, sort of modernly wanted as a sort of proto-doctrinal system, right? They have to choose to switch from sort of a modest number to a prevalence of pikes, right? You also find these other incidents. For example, when direct war with France came in 1444, a modest Swiss contingent of 2,000 to 3,000 men was entirely crushed by French cavalry. This is not, we should make a bit about that battle because it's really interesting. And the survivors forced to retreat, and France was victorious within a single day. Right? This is the engagement known as the Battle of Saint Jacob and the Bears, 1444. Right? Nobody mentions it, or at least it's fairly famous if you know Swiss history. And it's admittedly a contained battle. Like the Swiss force was of roughly, again, not even 1,500 men likely, depending, again, numbers can vary. We're a few thousands, right? Low thousands. They confronted a much larger French army as well under the Dauphin Louis. That, as you know, at that point, this is Louis, the future Louis the 11th, that was battling in the south to gain his own bases, eventually sort of clashing with his father Charles VII. He eventually was co-opted by the Burgundians. You know the story. Louis XI was also one of the greatest monarchs in French history. And here you want to appreciate, however, that the Swiss had taken that stand, so that they were not simply beaten down. They had an idea of themselves. They were overall capable of rising up once again. Although, in fact, the Swiss were annihilated after hours of fierce fighting, the ferocity of their resistance impressed contemporary observers and contributed to later French caution in dealing with Swiss infantry that would actually end up being employed, in fact, by the French, rather than sort of taken on, also for different sort of international reasons. I mean, had the French had to go at them, that it would have happened. I mean, the Burgundians at least did, were technically the same thing, but for different reasons. And so you understand how multifaceted this thing really is. When you look about what truly matters here is really the moral intensity, right? It's truly the spirit of corps, the sense of themselves, of of the community, in the broader political goal, right? This seemed very fragmented engagements. Of course, we're talking the Middle Ages, especially the post-Black Death period. It's really a misery in many ways. And in fact, maybe people have wanted to read too much even in this stuff because we know what the Swiss did later, but there's definitely something to it. And it's interesting to step by step appreciate all these various engagements, because here and there on Schwerpunkt we will cover them. You hear the names, they are mentioned. There are different indications of how important Swiss warfare is. But indeed, there is also much wider European history that I hope to be covering in some depth, right? Which is definitely useful for anyone wanted to be introduced to the topic. And so, protected by rugged mountain topography, ideally suited to infantry operations, narrow passes, steep slopes, and limited space for cavalry maneuver, the Swiss refined their doctrine of the dense pike square, at least after they decided that after being beaten yet by other knights, that this time the Milanese ones of Carmagnola at Arbedo, that had literally dismounted to take on the Swiss halberdiers at most did, and pikemen that had sort of shorter weapons than the same dismounted men-at-arms, which tells you also how successful sort of cavalry could be to begin with. They decided to truly reform and truly be something else. Also, this beating at the hands of the French had been somehow relevant. We can't be there in the tranquility of their cantons, were very well defendable, and so were in those beautiful mountains, lake landscapes, etc. Like they decided, this literally sat at a table and decided to ramp up their pike numbers, thereby sort of entailing massive investment in the collective training of unprecedentedly fielded formations. And that's how essentially proto-Renaissance warfare was ushered, and together with the continuous expansion of the Confederation that combined military successes but also with de facto political independence. So, yeah, I'm glad that we're finally talking about this stuff. It's really necessary at some point to expand on these topics. I like how we, after years, managed to cover this or that topic in some more precise terms. And we are definitely looking at the preconditions almost for many more in-depth videos, including the ones really evidently connected already with so much we've already done. But overall, I would say that we were making, again, an impressive amount of views, especially lately. There are always these ups and downs. It's really something that we must exploit on the long wave of views. It's always pleasant. But again, you like very much this first video about medieval infantry combat psychology. I provide you with this one as well that I hope serves its purpose. How is it from the other side? It's surreal. The fact that I made all these videos, it starts hitting like who would have thought this? And to me, it's just a secondary activity even, right? I don't even see it as this enormous commitment per se. But hey, we've gotten to this point, so let's as well, continue, right? I like doing this because it's incredibly useful to conceptualize the history of the art of war in the moment in which you explain it, right? It's difficult to do so. You always encounter, I don't find people who actually, as always said, that nobody has ever criticized my historical content on the basis of any evidence that I could see. But say there is something about what I'm doing that contains some implications people do not like. It's either standards or the sense that I really speak from a condition where I can't afford to, as evidently I am at this point, to say things are true about these topics that hopefully make sense. So to say, what do we do about it? Right, this is really important in many different ways, and let's see how to make it work properly as well. I think we owe it to each other. For those of you who have remained along the way. So many considerations could always be made around these topics. I do not reflect on the channel more than much anymore. We have all these videos and they're all very demanding, as we've seen here. Nevertheless, for today, I'll stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.